After these wonderful introductions, we're going to get now the first substantive panel, Session 1, Russia's Cyber and Communication Strategies in the War against Ukraine. So I'm Dominique Arel, I'm the Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Ottawa, not far from here, about 10-minute walk. We will have two speakers on this panel, Carolina Vendil Pallin, from the Swedish Defense Research Agency in Stockholm on Russia's cyber strategy and its war against Ukraine. And the second speaker will be Ofer Fridman from the Department of War Studies at King's College London, the Collage of Russia's communication strategy. So without further ado, Carolina.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. It's my first time in Canada, and I'm enjoying it immensely already. Overall, when we think of Russia and cyber, we think of offensive cyber operations, and we tend to think also about disinformation quite a lot. In my presentation, I will focus on the cyber aspects of Russian information warfare. I'll cover both the offensive aspects but also the defensive ones. And I'll explain why. I'll start by trying to define more narrowly what I mean when I talk about a Russian cyber strategy. I'll then outline the 5 components that I argue it consists of. Cyber preparations definitely played a role in the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, though perhaps not precisely the role that everyone expected. And finally, I'll also talk about Russia's cyber defense and how Russia became attacked in the war. It exposed many of the Russian weaknesses. I believe that this is not a time when we can afford not to be curious about Russian weaknesses. So I'm interested in Russia's cyber defense, not because I'm feeling sorry for Russia. I think it will also provide a fuller understanding of their thinking when it comes to information warfare. So when we talk about cyber, just a small note, what is this prefix? What does it say? Well, more or less, you could substitute it with the word IT or information technology. It's the technical networks, the infrastructure that we use when we send an email, when we're on social media, but it's also the operative systems for electric grids, for example. It's also the millions and millions of bank transfers that happen every day. And of course, it's the technical networks that Russia uses to spread disinformation. And as is obvious from the examples that I use, it's more than the internet. It's not just the networks that we can access through the internet, it's other networks as well, closed networks, that's included in cyber. But on the other hand, the internet is more than cyber, because the internet also consists of the content that we spread on it, but also the economic underpinnings of the internet, the regulatory framework that surrounds the internet. And then finally, as my colleague who's an IT expert always suggests, it's a word we use to sound cool. It sells books, it gets articles published. But what then is a Russian cyber strategy? Well, formally, Russia does not have a cyber strategy. It has an information doctrine and so on, but it doesn't actually single out the cyber aspects. But Russia is a cyber power. It needs a cyber defense. It needs to think about its cyber operations that we know they're conducting. But it's an orthodoxy almost in Russia that you always talk about information security, information warfare. And it's the FSB, the Federal Security Service, that is very much behind enforcing this. And so they have an information security doctrine from 2016. The armed forces has its concept for its activities in the information sphere, and you have paragraphs on information security in just about all the official security documents that you can come up with. The word cyber, kiber, never appears. But of course, Russia does have a cyber strategy. just as the United Kingdom has a constitution, even if it doesn't have a written one. And it's expressed in the doctrines and strategies, in government plans, in statements, but also in what it actually does, the activities that they undertake in this area. I suggest that there are 5 themes in Russia's cyber strategy. First of all, there's the one that very much centers around protecting critical information infrastructure. Russia has a system with a very beautiful acronym, of course, Gossopka, the state system for detecting, warning, and eliminating the consequences of computer attacks. But it also has splendid IT security companies. The Russian National Bank has its own center and so on. So it has mechanisms for cybersecurity. The second theme is one that has always worried Russia. It's that it's dependent on imports when it comes to IT technology. They've been worried about this ever since the first information security strategy was published in 2000, and probably before that, but then they've not been able to do very much about it. It might actually be happening now after 2022, but perhaps not in the way they like to have seen it happen. The third component, and this is where the distinction between what Russia would call psychological aspects of information warfare and technical aspects become blurred. This is the Russian government's effort to create or to establish control over what it terms a Russian segment of the internet. In fact, I would suggest that this was always the main goal when they said they were going to create a sovereign internet. Their main concern was always controlling what content is actually available to Russian internet users. Yes, they created a kill switch, but I think it was always intended just to be used to when they had protest or social unrest. So it's all about the controlling the internet. The fourth component is Russia's efforts to try and influence how we govern the internet internationally. And together with countries like China, they want to see a greater role for governments rather than the multi-stakeholder approach that we have. And then they're always talking about an information security agreement, because what they want to do is to control what content is available to their citizens, not to increase functionality or make certain that you don't have serious disruptions. And finally, the component that Russia never talks about, in fact, they always deny it. Of course, they're engaged in cyber operations. What do we know about Russian cyber operations? Well, they're probably among the top 5. The US is number 1, and then there's nothing and there's nothing, and then you have a group of countries that are in tier 2, so to speak, among the world's cyber powers. So they're in the second tier, together with countries like China, but certainly also the UK and Israel, for example. And there are 4 features of Russian cyber operations that are worth taking note of. First of all, they're active along the whole scale of cyber operations, from the relatively unsophisticated DDoS attacks to the more sophisticated when they enter and take over industrial control systems, for example. This is what puts them in the top 5. Secondly, Russia always denies that they're engaging in cyber operations. I have not come across a country that actually admits that it's engaging in offensive cyber operations, but there's a difference here. Actually denying it is going a step further. I would argue that what Russia does then, it's part of their information operation as a whole, because cyber operations in Russia are always part of a larger information operation. So when they deny it, and we all know that they did it, what they're doing is saying, we do this because we can, and we deny it because we can, and because you can do nothing about it. Furthermore, Russia is quite reckless when it comes to its cyber operations. They don't include safety mechanisms to make sure that there are no collateral damage. The best example is probably the NotPetya virus. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was a virus that was targeting a Ukrainian accounting company. It spread through Ukraine, among other cities, to Odessa. where you had a Danish shipping company, Maersk, for example, and it spread through their internet systems. It's the most costly cyber operation to date. It even spread back to Russia. It boomeranged back to Russia, and one of the companies that had problems with it was Rosneft. So they're reckless when they construct their cyber operations. And then finally, one thing that countries like Russia, authoritarian countries engaging, is that they use cyber operations against their own citizens as well. So what actually happened in Ukraine? I think a lot of people were expecting cyber operations to play a larger role than they did. We know that Russia planned and did execute cyber operations during the invasion, but it didn't play the role that many people had expected. And my colleague, Per-Erik Nielsen, he wrote a report with a number of hypotheses about this. And I think there were a number of explanations, the first of which was that Ukraine was well prepared. Ukraine had been a test bed for Russian cyber operations ever since 2014 and probably before that. So it was well prepared. And Ukraine received a lot of help from outside. Russia did not. Companies like Microsoft were already in Ukraine, and other countries also helped Ukraine. The expectations on what you can do with cyber operations in a war were inflated before 2022. It is inherently difficult to integrate cyber attacks with kinetic attacks. We have a few examples where they might have been coordinated. But cyber attacks are typically a strategic resource. They're typically conducted by intelligence and security services. In Russia's case, the military intelligence, the GRU, and the FSB. Malicious code and 0 days, they are expensive. And unlike artillery shells, you can't produce new ones. Once you've used them, they're out there. And having said that, I mean, it might be the case that cyber attacks actually played a larger role than we know of, because this is very much the area of the cloak and dagger community. So we don't know the full story. I should say that as a caveat. But finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, cyber operations did play a role, but they played a role in preparing the battlefield. That's when they're most effective. When you have bombs raining down on you, your main concern is not getting access to the internet or doing a bank transfer. So they're more important, I think, when it comes to preparing the battlefield. And what happened was actually that Russia got problems. Probably Russia felt quite confident that it was a prominent cyber power. It routinely ranked as one of the world's leading cyber powers. It had its Gossopka system. It conducted cyber exercises as part of its legislation on a sovereign internet. It had its own narrative on a sovereign internet that I think made them secure. And they viewed themselves as the aggressor in the cyber domain. And then, of course, they hoped that the war would be over in a few days or in a few weeks. And that was perhaps the reason why the head of Roskomnadzor, that's the Russian government authority for monitoring and surveillance of the internet, he said in October 2021, after one of these cyber exercises, that Russia was well prepared. It could withstand any interference from abroad. I love this quote. It tells you a lot about the Russian bureaucratic system, I think. What happened was that Russia became the most attacked country in cyberspace on the 24th of February, 2022. The targets were typically political, government authorities, public administration, the finance sector, Kremlin-loyal media. They started out as relatively unsophisticated attacks. We learned a new word, hacktivism, as internet users around the world were coordinated by Ukraine's IT army to target specific authorities inside Russia. I think this is important as well because Ukraine showed that it had agency. It was not just being overrun by Russia. And as this happened, the regular cyber attacks that have always taken place against Russia, not least Chinese espionage, continued. And Russia did not use its kill switch. This was not what the sovereign internet was about. And Russia discovered that it had supply chain vulnerabilities. Outsourcing software development to Cyprus, for example, is a very good idea as long as you're not at war. And that company actually employing Ukrainian software developers, it's not a big problem as long as your country is not invading a neighboring peaceful country. RUW, the Russian attempt at building something similar to YouTube, discovered this, and it seemed that the attackers actually had access to the source code, which suggests that someone involved in developing the software was attacking it. So, tracking what actually happened, I used some databases of cyber attacks. I also used Russian IT security companies, their yearly reports. And thirdly, I used the measures that Russia undertook to try and rectify the situation. And I always cite one of the presidential decrees that came in May 2022, which said that all government authorities had to create an IT security department. And I sat there thinking, what? You didn't have one? So obviously, preparations had not been made. Furthermore, sanctions made Russia extra vulnerable. They couldn't update their security software. They couldn't patch 0 days because they couldn't update operative systems and so on. And then another interesting aspect. There used to be a truce among cyber criminals in the former Soviet countries. It was broken when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. And Russia became a legitimate target because they used to provide a safe haven for cyber criminals. And this is still one of the major problems for Russia. It has cyber criminality on a scale that it has not had before. And together, all of this creates a noise of war. And I think one of Russia's main concerns is that the really dangerous and sophisticated cyber operations could be hiding in this noise of war that Russia is experiencing. So finally, what are the main conclusions? It's a truism, but I think it's worth underlining. War changes everything. The rules that you think apply, they apply no longer. Russia was not well prepared. I think they were fooled by their own rhetoric, not least the one on a sovereign internet. They believed that they could somehow not be dependent on the internet, but the internet is a network of networks, and Russia was deeply integrated into it. I think another contributing factor is that Russia had not singled out cyber aspects. And especially an older generation in the Russian Security Council, not least, because they always talk about information security, they tend not to focus on technology and code, but rather on their pet projects that have to do with cognitive security and sovereignty, or psychotronic influence, and they also talk about the anthroposphere. Very strange, I must admit, but they focus very much on that. Furthermore, Russia was lagging behind, and it's going to lag even more behind when it comes to digital technologies. And sanctions and the overall geopolitical situation has left Russia deeply dependent on China. They try to do overtures to the global south, for example, but they have nothing like the economic and technological clout that China has. And a more general consequence is that I think we'll see a more fragmented internet. I just want to underline, this is not either or, an integrated internet or a fragmented one. It's a question about degrees. And Russia will be forced to develop its own software to a very large degree, or depend on Chinese ones. With time, what a Russian internet user sees when they open their computer or their phone will look different from what we see. And we don't even know what this means for the future of information warfare. But I would suggest that it will make sense to keep our eyes peeled. This is Oleg. He will turn 70 in December this year, and he's a very good example of how they manage information security in Russia. They have several deputy secretaries, but he's the one responsible for information security. He's giving an interview when this picture was taken, or they sent it with the written answers to the interview. He's giving an interview on cyber strategy, and his room is inundated with old telephones. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm going to speak on Russian communication strategy, which is based on several projects that I'm involved in. I will give some details about this project in a moment. But before that, I want to speak a little bit about collage. Collage is frequently confused with puzzle. The idea of puzzle is that you understand the picture, you give the sense of the whole only once you assemble it. Collage, on the other hand, is a collection of bits and pieces of different material, of different art that make sense together, but also as pieces separately. I frequently hear from my colleagues who study Russian communications, oh, Russian strategy, or they don't have strategy. Their strategy is to throw spaghetti to the wall to see what sticks and what doesn't stick. This is not true. And it comes from the idea that if you're looking for only one side of the collage and you suddenly compare it to the other side, it does not make sense. Because collage makes sense as a whole piece together. And I will try to explain how Russian strategy is a collage. We collected data on different projects from different sources. The project that I was involved with, it's funded by NATO Stratcom COE together with Debunk. We collected Russian official websites. How Russian officials' websites, all their ministries communicate on the websites. In terms of the target audience, mainly Russian domestic, but also international. This is the main source of the official communications of the Kremlin. In other sources, we went and collected Twitter and Telegram accounts of more than 130 Russian embassies around the world. This is Russian official communications, how Russians MFA communicates around the world. And then we also collected Russian language Telegram ecosystem, mainly war-related. Some of them have kind of Baltic target Baltic audiences, some of them Ukrainian audiences, and some of them Russian domestics. So let's start from the global picture, Russian official communications worldwide. As I said, we collected more than 129 countries over Twitter and Telegram. By the way, if anybody was following Russian Telegram communications, particularly MFA, presence on Telegram, you didn't have to be in deep intelligence rooms. Day before the invasion, all Russian embassies around the world created Telegram accounts. What do you think will be the country with most active embassy? Well, Kazakhstan is understandable. The second one is Japan. Then you think, okay. These are the top most active embassies around the world. If you can see here, generally it can be divided into sort of three groups. The first group, adversaries. So you have NATO members, Germany, United States, other members of NATO. The second one are kind of sort of friends, partners, if you like, obviously Kazakhstan, Iran. But then you have also countries of interest. For example, here you can see Senegal, Lebanon, Romania, which has a very good interest. We're all aware of that interest after the elections. So there is a certain logic behind it. There is a certain allocation of resources behind it. Now, Japan. Why is Japan? Why Japan is the most active embassy? So we decided to look at a few examples here. The first one was Japan. This is the weekly number of comments by a Russian embassy just before the beginning of the war until the end of 2024. We can clearly see there is a general division. They communicate differently on Telegram and on Twitter in different quantities and on different events. But this is not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is the language. So usually the embassy representation will communicate information in three different aspects. First of all, they will communicate to their own citizens in the country, celebrate the holidays, come to exchange visas, come to renew passports, that sort of communications, which will be usually done in the language of the embassy. The second sort of communication will be to present the opinion of the state on different events in the world. And the third one is to communicate to the local audiences. which will be done in local language. We can see a clear change in strategy, so we can target in audiences across the time. We can see in the beginning of the war, the communications were mainly divided into one-third, one-third, and one-third across 3 main languages. Currently, English completely disappeared. They communicate in Japanese and in Russian, 50-50. And when we showed their posting to our Japanese colleagues and representatives from the Japanese government, who usually believe, well, Japanese is a complicated language and you can clearly separate it. This is not ChatGPT generated messaging in Japanese. This is proper Japanese that a Japanese person cannot separate it and say this is kind of artificially created or not. If we're talking about, okay, so what they're talking about. So we decided to focus on Ukraine and NATO. How much of the content pushed by Russian embassy in Japan is not about Russian pelmeni or Russian ballet, but actually about topics that matter to Russia. This is in percentages. So you can see on average about 35% of Russian communications in Japan about Ukraine. And believe me, they are not saying that Ukraine is a great state to the Japanese audiences. Slightly less, about 15% on average, they're talking about NATO. And believe me, they're not saying that the NATO is a great alliance. So we decided to see, okay, so what are they actually saying? Well, when they're talking about Ukraine, what are the associated words that they use in talking about Ukraine? They're basically talking about, when they mention Ukraine, they mention about West. In Ukraine, it's about war with the West. Western countries, with the Western people, etc. When they're talking about NATO, they're talking about the United States. And the difficult relationship, particularly around Okinawa and other areas in Japan, trying to undermine the relationship between Japan and United States. And this is in the highest percentage in Japanese to Japanese people. Now, another case that we decided to focus on is Argentina. Why Argentina? Well, because Argentina is far away, it seems to be out of the interest of anybody. Nobody cares what is happening in Argentina. So here we can see completely different strategy. First of all, we can see a perfect correlation between what Russians are saying and how much they're saying on their Twitter and Telegram. If you remember, in Japan, there were 2 different sort of communications. Here we can see a perfect alliance, and it's all in Spanish. It's not in English, not in Russian. In Argentina, they speak in Spanish. And what do they say? Well, they say about Ukraine and NATO. So here we have, again, about 35% of Russian embassy in Argentina communications are about Ukraine. Much less about NATO, because Argentina is far away from NATO. They don't feel this topic is important for their Argentinian audiences. When they speak about Ukraine, they speak about Western world, because war in Ukraine, in their communications, it's not a war in Ukraine. There is no war in Ukraine. There is a war against the West, and West is a colonial power, and remember what is happening with the West, and they do it in perfect Spanish in Argentina. When they speak about NATO, there is a high correlation between these two. So this is one part of the collage. Another interesting part of the collage is the Russian official websites. So we collected all this data and we said, okay, so how much are they talking about war in Ukraine? Well, sorry, it's a special military operation. They don't speak about war. If you look at how much they speak about war, 0. But how much they speak about Ukraine or about special military operation? Apparently, much less than they speak abroad. When we look at, for example, Ministry of Defense, the ministry responsible for the special military operation in Ukraine, their mentioning of special military operation in Ukraine is around like 17%. Plus, sometimes it's going a little bit higher. What are the rest of communications about? Oh, we built a new barracks. Oh, we conducted a nice exercise. We introduced a new piece of equipment. Things as usual. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the only ministry that actually speaks a little bit about Ukraine and the special military operation. The rest don't. It's like nothing happens. Well, on the one hand, we should remember that, well, I have never done this lecture in Ottawa. I usually do it across European capitals. And my punch point is that we should remember that here we are closer to the battlefield than people in Vladivostok. Probably does not apply to Ottawa. But for the majority of Russians who consume this sort of information, it's a distant battle, a distant conflict, and Kremlin wants to keep it this way. And they don't communicate about it. Russian Telegram ecosystem. So we collected these millions of tweets from more than 300 Telegram channels. I'm aware that during the day we will hear much deeper analysis of Twitter. But what we decided to do, we decided to separate all the comments that we collected on Twitter to 4 main dimensions and see what they're talking about. So we separated everything using these keywords to military, foreign, economic dimensions and the dimension of liberated, because they're speaking about, they are occupied, but they don't speak about occupied territories. They speak about liberated, so we put them in. This is what we're looking for. With all economic sanctions and perceived or real economic hurdles in Russia, the economic topic comes last. Most of the communications are about foreign relations. This is what the ecosystem, the Telegram ecosystem talks about. Then we have military, then we have liberated. The topic related to economic issues in Russia or in liberated territories or etc. is the lowest one. This is not something that communicated within the system. So what they're talking about the military, when they speak about the military dimension, about the operation. First of all, they're talking about Western hardware in Ukraine, which is an interesting topic. It comes particularly after 22 and increasing 23. They're very careful in staging what they're saying, how they're saying. They follow in the great details every Western destroyed tank. They love references to Western media. They love some obscure Western politician from somewhere, nowhere, who will come and say something that will correlate with what they're saying and will amplify it on their networks. Well, okay, I will not speak about newly elected American president. They have much more references to the Western media and Western politicians than to their own media and their own politicians. They speak about Russian air attacks. They speak about Russian air defense. They speak much less about Ukrainian attacks, regardless how successful they are. And then, interestingly, now they're talking a lot about Western support to Ukraine and how inefficient, fragmented, or unsuccessful it will be. This is on Telegram. We did the same in the Russian official communications, and the picture is completely different. On Russian official websites, they speak about completely different topics. There's a small correlation in the military, so yes, they speak about destruction of Ukrainian forces, but then they speak a lot about training and readiness in the central military district, in Russian military, in all their districts, international training, games, etc. This is what the official communications in the military dimension will look like. Now, if we're trying to compare the major narratives, so these are too many narratives to comprehend. So let's focus on the 3 main ones. If we're looking for the major narratives in the military dimension on Telegram, then what we can see is the Western hardware in Ukraine, reports from the front lines, and Western support to Ukraine. This is the main communications on Telegram. In official communications, it's all about training and destruction of Ukrainian forces. If we're trying to combine these with the global picture, which I presented earlier, which I forgot to mention, the pilot study was funded by the Polish MFA and published by the Community of Democracies, which I done together with my Canadian colleague, Jean-Christophe Boucher from University of Calgary. But when we combine them all together, it does look like a collage. There's several main points out of this that we need to remember. First of all, if you're looking for only one side of the picture, well, this is my collage. There is not much information here. It's basically I took all the slides and stick them together. There are several points that we need to understand from there. First of all, in academia, we tend very frequently to focus on one side of the point. And when we are faced with something else, it's just throwing spaghetti, which is, they're not throwing spaghetti. In every type of their communication, in every target audience, there is a careful consideration, allocation of resources, creation of narratives, dissimulation of narratives, etc. Secondly, to understand Russian communication, we need to approach it as a collage. We need to recreate this collage, which we in academia frequently struggling to do. There's plenty of research on Telegram only. There's plenty on media only. All of it done with different methodologies in different time frames. So you actually even cannot combine them together. We are missing the forest for the trees. And if we focus on the bushes and suddenly we see the tree, we say, no, they're throwing spaghetti. It can't be true, which is not the case. And I think I'm just on time, so thank you very much for listening.
I have my first question to Ofer Fridman. First of all, thank you for your service, for analyzing all of those Russian government websites and Telegram channels. It must have been daunting. You talked a lot about not focusing specifically on one aspect of information and instead having to discover many different pieces before you can see the overlapping themes in the content. How do you approach this work? What did it take you to understand where to focus and how to filter out the general themes? How we can use this approach when it comes for us to learning the bigger picture before we can analyze the impact of communications? Thank you.
Yeah, so I already accused academia for not doing the right job. But I think it has to be solved by more collaboration. And that collaboration can come in different forms. It can come bottom-up from academia itself. It can come top-down from those who fund academia. We find we're highly specialized. One focus on Telegram and another focus on media, on kind of media monitoring or whatever. We need to bring this all together. There are several projects funded by the EU that are trying to do that. But essentially, we need to understand this collage and, more importantly, to start trying to counter it. Because although the topic of this conference is Ukraine, I think in Russian communication strategy, Ukraine is not the goal. Ukraine is the means in their information warfare for the rest of the world. We need to understand how they're using it. We need to understand through what channels, to what audiences. Unfortunately, they've been quite successful. The number of BRICS countries doubled since the beginning of the war. What happens in French Africa, we're all aware, or in other places in the global south. Practically, we need more collaboration, whether it comes bottom-up or top-down.
I have a question to you, Mr. Fridman, too. In your slide about this narrative that you distilled in military, for example, cluster, have you been seeded model with some specific narratives before, or it just pure clustering and topic modeling, and how much oversight your researchers have when they are interpreting the model's output?
As I said, this is a project that I've been involved with Debunk.org. This is the first time that we try to do bare topic. Previous alternations of this research, we do it we were looking top down for narratives. This is bare topic analysis, bottom up. Later on, we labeled and interpret them.
I'll take the next one myself to Carolina. If you could clarify two things you said. When you said cyber operations, Russian cyber operations prepared the battlefield. What do you mean by that? And the famous kill switch. In real time back then, 3 years ago, I had a dear colleague who was actually at the Pentagon. So he was kind of feeding me, well, not confidential information, but his anxiety. One of the greatest fears was that the Russians would be able on day one to basically have Ukraine go dark, kill the internet, literally. Is that what you meant, or is that something else? The follow-up question is, why couldn't the Russians do that, actually? There's a lot of things that they couldn't do on the first day, including that.
Thank you. First of all, to prepare the battlefield, I mean, Russia was present in a lot of Ukrainian networks. And Microsoft was there and helped them discover those intrusions. For example, they hacked into different registers so that they could map Ukrainian citizens and target them specifically when they occupied areas. I mean, just using cyber operations to try and undermine Ukraine's will to defend themselves, and hacking into electric grids is a typical example of that. You prepare the battlefield, but when you're actually, and this brings me to the second question of why they couldn't make Ukraine go black completely, it's much more difficult. I mean, to actually get into critical information systems, it's difficult to gain access. And it's even more difficult to stay there to use it at this precise time when you need to. It's expensive, and you'll be discovered, usually. Very often when Russia engages in cyber operations, and this is a bit of the spaghetti argument, I mean, they'll try and enter a lot of systems, and they'll enter where the defenses are weak, because actually targeting a specific organization is much more difficult and takes a lot more resources. A kill switch, I mean, when I talked with my colleagues who are IT experts, because I work at a government agency that is 80% of them are engineers and technical researchers. And when I talk to my colleagues who are IT experts, I mean, they use kill switch in a different way. But usually the way we talk about kill switch is something that a country can use when they're attacked from the outside, or an organization that's attacked from the outside. And then you cut your connections with the outside just to protect your own system. But Russia, I mean, first of all, I don't think their kill switch is actually functioning yet the way they would want to. But as I said, I think it was always about protecting themselves from political unrest rather than the functionality.
I would have two questions to Karolina Pallin. Very good presentation. And you said that Russia was not prepared for the cyber attacks. Is it now prepared for that? What they changed, improved? Can we somehow make them more vulnerable? And the second question, you said, and I agree with you, that the sovereign internet is not sovereign, it's not controlled. But the frustration that we have, for example, how to reach Russian audience, right? Because, okay, they blocked Instagram at the beginning of war. When I was talking to my journalist colleagues from Russian independent media, they were saying, okay, we are saying them that there is a war, that Russians attacking, they are killing, torturing, etc. But it doesn't matter. People knows that very well. So that's why they get rid of, okay, we don't need to have blocking Instagram, because people does not care in Russia about what is going on in Ukraine. But also to Ofer, I would have one question, because you said that they are picturing on the official sides that the war is very far away from Russians. But how about Ukraine? Because my colleague journalist, Polish journalist, he said that when he looked at the Russian propaganda, Russian TV, the impression is that Russia is surrounded by Ukraine. All the time, Ukraine is on the topic. So on one side, you were elaborating the website, but how about the propaganda network? Thank you.
No, Russia was not prepared. I think it didn't really enter their minds that Ukraine would be so skillful as they were. And also the whole thing about the cyber criminal community breaking down, I think that was also news for them, and not very pleasant news. Cybercriminality is still a major problem for Russia, and I don't think it will go away. They haven't been able to rectify that, but they are introducing their own operative systems, especially when it comes to government authorities. They're developing their own IT security software. They are getting more control of the situation, definitely. I'm trying to track whether they are changing their thinking so that they would focus more on functionality. Because, I mean, part of this internet sovereignty legislation actually reduces functionality, because all the internet service providers are forced to install equipment to filter content, and this actually makes the internet work slower, and Russia stands before a huge challenge when it comes to building the next generation of infrastructure for the internet, because we use more and more data year on year, and Russia will have to build more infrastructure at a time when they just don't have the money, and they don't even have they haven't decided on frequencies for 5G and so on. all of these are challenges that threaten to, I think, overwhelm Russia. I definitely don't see them building their own hardware. They built their own Yota phone. I don't know if you heard about that, their own smartphone. It was basically a number of components imported and put together inside Russia, and then they put a sticker on made in Russia. And following the Yota phone's life in Russia, I mean, I looked at the comment field at one time in RBK, if it was Kommersant, and someone wrote that, does anyone have a Yota phone? The only ones I see have them are grannies of people who are state employed. I mean, I don't see them getting very far there. They're going to be dependent on Chinese software and Chinese hardware, which is a major problem for them. How to reach a Russian audience? It will become increasingly difficult, especially if they learn more about blocking VPNs, which they are doing. But I would venture that the main problem is not the technical side to it. The main problem is that Russians do not want to hear what you want to transmit about Ukraine. I often get this question, what can the EU do? It doesn't matter how much you send this information into Russia. If Russians do not want to listen, then it makes no sense. And actually, I'm very inspired by Peter Pomerantsov's latest book. He argues that, you need to talk about things that Russia wants to hear, and then you can perhaps target other things in Russia that they're unhappy with, but they're not unhappy with what Russia is doing in Ukraine, I think. And the people who already have VPNs, I mean, they're not the people that we need to convince.
Just to to continue Peter Pomerantsov here, you need to say what they want to hear and not what you want to say. This is the key in any CIUS. The problem is not technological, the problem is psychological. Currently, they don't want to hear what we want to say. That's the problem. Now, about your comment about TV, well, because of the short of time, I did not have time to present another piece of the collage, which was Russian TV, which is completely different sort of communications, completely different audiences, different from Telegram and different from official websites, etc., which says something differently. So part of the exercise, what we did, we transcribed the TVs and run it again to per topic. And we want to say what they say about Ukraine. Apparently, they don't speak a lot about Ukraine. They speak about special military operation and how they are surrounded by the West. And the special military operation is not actually against Ukrainians. It's against the West. In most of their communications, kind of on TV, and again, TV by itself, it's a collage. We need to separate between weekly shows with Solovyov and other stars, to daily news, which are more concrete and different. Obviously, all, particularly news, they do follow Metodichka, which is kind of clear guidance from above, what to say and how to present things. They don't talk too much about Ukraine. The fight in the war, so the special military operation in Ukraine is against the West, and the West is surrounding us. There's much less talk about the fighting against the Ukrainian people. This is reserved for the weekly shows. So yes, you're completely right. It's not there because kind of we did this research. I didn't have time to present it, but it's a part of the collage, and we need to understand it as a whole. As you've seen, the websites, the official Kremlin communications, they're not talking about the war.
I have a question to Ofer Fridman. You were talking about Russian informational warfare. In your opinion, how is it going currently? Did they succeed in it? And if yes, what West should do to counter the informational warfare started by Russia? Thank you.
First of all, I did not mention in 20 minutes of my presentation the term information warfare. I was speaking about communication strategy. Russian communications. This is an important difference. We need to be very careful with the terms that we use, because if we use them correctly, it means that we understand them, and if we use them incorrectly, it means that we don't understand them. About your question, the war in Ukraine is the means, it's not the goal in the information, in the communication strategy around the world. I think this is what we need to understand. This is what we currently, the West, struggles to understand. and struggles to act. We do better in trying to understand it. We do much worse in trying to do something about that. If we look since the beginning of the war, as I said, Russian attempts to convince the rest of the world not to love Russia. They are not in a soft power exercise, but to descend the West and disconnect from the West and look for alternatives to be highly successful. To convince the rest of the world that democracy is failing, that it's the Western fault. If we're looking at the public opinion polls, which currently the only way to try and measure the impact of information operations, if we're looking for the global south, we are losing there. And they're using Ukraine in their communication, trying to undermine the trust given by global south in the Western institutions, in the Western countries, etc. What we need to do, I think, first of all, we need to understand that what is happening in Ukraine, physically happening in Ukraine, but virtually is happening around the world. Although on the ground is the battle for Ukraine, there is a worldwide, global battle in information space for the future of the global order. And we need to start fighting it to increase our focus a little bit, because currently now it's all focused on Ukraine.
Well, I want to thank our speakers for a great panel. Carolina from Sweden, Ofer from London, UK, leading the fight now this week. Yes, with the Prime Minister Starmer.